Our final speaker before we turn to a panel discussion is Gabrielle Tayac. Gabrielle is a historian, a member of the Piscataway Nation, and she is going to explore a variety of Native traditional reconciliation practices to introduce cultural grounding for understanding apologies. Her talk is titled At the Wood's Edge, Reconciling with Native America. She will make comparisons with Western philosophical traditions that guide current political efforts across the hemisphere and consider the possibilities for profound cultural change that recalibrates relationships with Native America. Dr. Tayac.
I'd like to thank you all for being here this afternoon, and I was very deeply affected by the powerful presentations that have preceded me. Certainly the weight of centuries and centuries of suffering have brought us to this point. And something that I've also heard very frequently over the past 2 weeks, as I heard echoed over and over again in the words of our honored speakers before me, which was, did you ever think that you would live to see this day? It's a point that I've heard on the metro daily. Walking in the streets, hearing it from neighbors, and not only in regards to certainly our elections, but I think it's certainly a process of worldwide social change that we have seen, and now it has deeply affected and come to sit with us on this beloved Turtle Island, this beloved Western Hemisphere that we all occupy and live with. I was very, very moved by the images that I saw through the other presentations, so I'm feeling this very emotionally. I entitled this at the Wood's Edge because it's a moment that we come to transform from one state to another. It's about a call to condolence, and I'll repeat some of the words that I've heard and have seen repeated in short form. Here we have a photo of Chief Jake Thomas, who was one of the people who preserved this tradition of reconciliation within Native America. And in the traditional words, they say, "Now then we say, we wipe away the tears, so that in peace you may look about you. And further we suppose there is an obstruction in your ears. Now then we remove the obstruction carefully from your hearing, so that we trust you will easily hear the words spoken. And also we imagine there is an obstruction in your throat. Now therefore we say, we remove the obstruction, so that you may speak freely in our mutual greeting." And certainly often we hear the idea that reconciliation and apology grounded in the Western legislative processes. We've heard example after example today, but it's certainly a very deep and profound process that we see throughout Native traditions, and this ceremony of condolence is done among the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people to this day. And using what's called the condolence cane, this is an image of it that records the roll call of chiefs. What is reconciliation? What does the word mean in English? It comes from the Latin conciliare, which means to meet. So that when you have reconciliation, it means to meet again. And we find that there's a profound philosophical concept both in Western European derived cultures and in indigenous cultures. Sometimes it's spoken about that that when you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have taken place throughout the world, certainly most notably in the 90s when South Africa finally abolished its apartheid system, and here we see examples from Reverend Desmond Tutu speaking on that. We know that there's Truth and Reconciliation, which has taken place in Latin America, in Argentina, in East Timor, in Bosnia, throughout the world. And often the idea of apology and reconciliation is indeed coming perhaps from a Catholic tradition of the penance, the sacrament of penance. So to get to this point, to understand that we're in a very contemporary period, you wonder, how is it possible that we could wait until the 21st century to start to see these apologies come through when it's something that is so deeply rooted in Western civilization? What is it that took us so long to get to this point? And even going back further into the Judaic traditions, we know that we have the days of atonement in Yom Kippur, for example. And these are days that not only is it an idea of atoning and asking for reconciliation with God, as happens in Catholic confession, but there's not only the idea of apology and coming to speak the truth, of somehow purging and purifying yourself, but there can't only be the enunciation of words, there has to be action behind it. You have to repair the relationship. And that's something that's also been mentioned by every single speaker and every single actor who's worked on reconciliation with Native people. Going back to the condolence cane traditions, it's the idea that in very old times, when groups of Haudenosaunee statesmen would travel from one town to the next, they would have to go through the forests, through these tremendous expanses, and perhaps pass through brambles and thickets and difficulties and all kinds of negative and difficult energies, perhaps very dangerous spiritual forces. And so there was the idea that when you came to the edge of a town, perhaps to enter into negotiation with another party, that first you would have to basically address what had occurred to you, to cleanse the negative emotions from you. And then when you greeted the people that you wanted to go into some kind of diplomacy with, you would have to acknowledge each other and to acknowledge the fact that perhaps there had been people in their town that you had hurt, or from them that they had caused the deaths of others. And so very upfront, before you can even begin to speak, you have to acknowledge the dead. You have to acknowledge the harm that might have been caused and to apologize for it. And that's an idea of coming to a clarity, an understanding of purpose, and also taking accountability. And that's really fundamental to every single piece that we've seen here today, whether it was the apology in Canada, the efforts that have been made in Guatemala under incredibly difficult circumstances, the work that's being done in the United States now. The idea is really about accountability. It's about taking responsibility so that you can move forward. I'd like to go further to the west, and this image that's here was something that happened in 1990 in bitter, bitter cold weather, sub-zero temperatures, with 300 riders going over 250 miles, excuse the typo, to go through a ceremony that was enacted through this ride to retrace the steps of a group of people with Chief Bigfoot who eventually were murdered in the massacre of 1890 at Wounded Knee. And the idea was to wipe away the tears of the 100 years of pain and sorrow, to enact actually through the writing, through the retracing of the steps of the people who had suffered this within the community, to converge 100 years later, to get on horseback together as a community and ride through blizzards and difficult circumstances. I had even talked to somebody, Mel Lonehill, who had been the chair at Pine Ridge for some time, and he said that during that period of time it was so cold that one of his horses actually froze to death standing. Yet these people, men, women, and children, took it upon themselves to do this ride and to renew their communities. So often these ideas of reconciliation, it's an act that has to be done within the self, within the person, from the Native community itself. And then often that gets then projected out into a larger society. That very year in 1990, South Dakota declared a year of reconciliation. The idea, as Orville Looking Horse, who was the holder of the white buffalo woman Pipe had said that, recalled that at 1890, the idea was that the sacred hoop had been broken. And the idea that 100 years later, people could empower themselves, find their own strength, and make that ride, and retrace those steps, and do the ceremony of wiping away the tears in order to mend the hoop. And as Virgil Kilstraight, who was a key organizer of the events in 1990, he said, "It is said that where the four powers cross, it is sacred. The great power of the north, with its cleansing cold and wind, once again wiped away what is bad, and gave us new understanding of the sacred. As we return to this center, let us not forget all that we learned and experienced in this journey back from the past. Let us rebuild our nations and mend the sacred hoop." We can also go even further to the west and to the south, with the idea that has emerged very clearly throughout Native America, and we also see this in the reconciliation efforts made within the nation states of the Western Hemisphere. And actually, there should be an accent over Dine. Sorry. The idea of Dine restorative justice, which is a very powerful legal force that's happening at the moment. And through the concept of Hojoji Nat Ani, which means people talking together to reform relationships with each other and the universe. It's the idea that there's an inherent worth of all human beings, that each person, no matter what their act, that they're a creation of the holy people. And therefore, you can criticize the act and the behavior, but the person themselves is deeply worthwhile. And I think as each party can approach each other on this human basis, on this holy basis, then we have a sense that from an indigenous perspective, reconciliation has to happen, but it has to happen through restoration rather than retribution. And that's, I think, a cornerstone to each case that's been stated today. The idea that we are restoring, mending, amending, and healing. And so, as was said, it really is a point where we're going into a new day for 7 generations forward. We see our children who may or may not have directly experienced the violence and repression that we saw through the residential schools, through the civil wars, through the removal periods. But the idea, as was mentioned certainly in Canada, the United States, and in Guatemala, the idea of being uprooted, what does that mean for children? What does that mean for our societies? And I think that we are definitely at a point where, since we have lived to see this day, since there are so many who had not lived to see this day, the idea that the people, for example, of the survivors of residential schools, those who didn't make it to hear those words, that the impossible was achieved, that we have people still in Guatemala who are suffering from reverberating violence and also still have not been able to find peace as immigrants in this country, that it's so difficult. In the graphic description that Senator Nighthorse Campbell made of passing legislation simply to acknowledge what's happened, not that it will change just by the words, but that it does open the conversation, that we're able to face what we need to face. So individually and collectively, I do think that given this point that's taken centuries and centuries to arrive at this time, we can give a moment of thanksgiving to greet the new day, to clear away the brambles and the obstacles, and to greet each other at this moment, because it is certainly quite apparent that in 2008 another world is possible. That I'd like to say thank you and open it for questions.